Welcome to Trulyfit, the online fitness marketplace connecting pros and clients through unique fitness business software.
Rebecca, thanks for joining the Trulyfit Podcast. We talked a little bit on the front end about your career and how you got into doing what you did. And I think it was very interesting because most personal trainers, people like myself who listen to this podcast, they start out in different careers, right? It's always a secondary or tertiary career. I was in public relations and then at a hedge fund and then worked personal training part-time and then got into it. And that's how most of us have gotten into our career fields. And it seems like you went through the same journey. So walk us through where you started and how you got to do what it is you do today.
Yes, I didn't find personal training found me. So just to start from the very beginning, when I was in high school, I did community theater and realized that the entertainment industry is where I felt like I was meant to be. Later down the line, I realized that on camera was more my path. And then I went to college where I graduated with a bachelor's in business administration with a concentration in marketing. But while I graduated a year early from college, I realized that working a cubicle 9 to 5 just was not going to work for me. I had done a couple internships that was required through my college. And I don't know if it was just maybe the people that I just in my heart, it just wasn't for me. And while I was in college, I had stopped doing on-camera work and was focusing on my degree, but I still wanted to keep in shape because I had always been very athletic. So certain situations came about where I ended up finding boxing as an outlet for just to relieve stress and just to keep me in shape. It was a great full body conditioning workout, which we'll talk about further in this episode. It was originally just supposed to be holding mitts, wasn't going to spar, just wanted to do it as an exercise. Ended up finding out I fell in love with the sport, started sparring, and realized that boxing was here to stay for me. And when I graduated college, I decided to apply to be a boxing instructor at the current gym that I work at, Upper Montclair Boxing Club. And I've been working there for now 4 years. It was supposed to just be kind of like a job that was just for the year while I try to figure myself out during the year I would have been graduating. Currently still there. And on that path, I found out that I can mix my knowledge of boxing and my experience on camera and put it together where I currently have my podcast, Inside the Ring with Rebecca Gruber.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. And again, like a lot of other people who are in this industry, in the personal training industry, we all found our ways through a different path. So I want to jump right into this here and talk about the boxing because people are nervous. When I first work with clients doing a little pad work, now my background is in Muay Thai, so my hands probably aren't as good as yours and we do more kicking, but still, when they first start out, they're nervous. Clients are nervous, but they always take to it and they always like it. And I also think personal trainers themselves are nervous to learn about it and use it with their clients. Can you describe just an experience that you use one-on-one with your clients or your first time in a class and how it goes about to give people a little bit less trepidation about starting boxing?
So it's kind of hard because everyone's different, right? So when I first started, like I said, I went into it with no intention of sparring because I was just super scared of getting hit in the face. And you always hear horror stories of people getting knocked out cold and no one wants to get knocked out cold. And there's just always that misconception when it comes to boxing. Boxing is a combat sport. It's also about the discipline. And so I try to teach people that to be a boxer isn't necessarily to be a fighter. Boxing and fighting are two completely different things. And when someone comes in new, I teach them, this is just how to defend yourself. My philosophy has never been to start a fight. But if someone starts something with you, you should be able to have the confidence to hold yourself, to know that if you had to, you could finish that fight and you can defend yourself if necessary. So I always get people started by just learning the 4 basic punches, the jab, cross, hook, and uppercut. And to teach them how to throw the punches, I like to kind of make it fun. So when I explain to someone how to throw a hook and I'm teaching them how to use their hips, because as you learn in boxing, it's more than just using the power in your hand, energy moving up through your body to throw the power in those punches. I always tell them that it's like you're stepping on a bug, you're squishing it out, and your arm goes across as if you're wiping your arm across a dusty dining room table. And doing those little analogies kind of alleviates any tension or any nerves that people have, because they're laughing at, okay, this is fun. They're not worried. I usually just have them start shadow boxing, because shadow boxing is really important. So once they realize they're not hitting anything or anybody, they're fine. Then when I put on the mitts later on in their first session, and then they start hitting the mitts, then they're like, oh, I like the feeling of hitting things. And as we progress, then you're hitting the mitts, you're hitting the bag. And then eventually, as you get more and more comfortable, as I get more comfortable with my clients, and I realize that they're starting to get comfortable with how I work holding mitts, when I see their hands starting to drop, I tap them on the head. And then they start giggling. They're like, okay, I should have kept my hands up. And so I slowly start introducing them the idea of boxing and how to defend yourself. And it ends up progressing. And a lot of people enjoy getting hit, not in the sense of they're getting knocked out, but they like the feeling of their adrenaline, like, oh, I really like knowing that I have to keep my hands up. And they like realizing how much more aware they have to be in those 3 minutes. And so I think it's more important just to slowly acclimate the client into what it is to be a boxer.
Yeah, that's great information. And I think to add to that, you never know who's going to take to it and who doesn't. I've had clients before, large male clients. So I'm like, you're going to love this. And it's just not for them, because maybe they do things similar to that and they want yoga and Pilates and things that are different for their bodies. And then I've had 110-pound girls who never touched a boxing mitt, and then all they want to do is box, right? Yes. They don't want to do anything else in personal training. They're like, I don't want to do anything else except kickbox today. So you never know who's going to take to it. And it's not just, like you said, it's not about learning how to fight necessarily. It's an exercise that's teaching you all about your body, how to, like you said, squash the bug. I use the term like put the cigarette out, right? Yes. Throw your hips into it, use your legs into the punch, and all these like subtle keys and nuances that we would use in any other lifting or exercise technique. We just transfer that over into boxing to let people make sure they're using their body as one. So with that down the road here, I want to talk about specifics as far as like gloves and shoes and all of that stuff. With my clients, obviously, I only use pads. They don't have specific shoes. They do have wraps. I let them use my gloves. But for somebody who is thinking about maybe taking it up a notch, let's say they're working with their trainer, they're working with you or me, and they're like, you know what? I want to start going to some classes. I want to start sparring. I'm going to take it up a level. Do you recommend any particular gloves or shoes or anything equipment wise?
Well, what's awesome about boxing is the equipment that you typically use isn't as expensive as it is to get baseball equipment or basketball equipment. But equipment is also very important too. So for starters, my first pair of boxing shoes were actually a pair of basketball shoes that I had growing up, because you don't want something with a heel, just because you kind of want to feel as much the ground as possible for when you're pivoting and moving around the ring. You want to have a better feel of the floor. But I always suggest, if you look up boxing shoes, it's kind of hard to find because there's not a lot of people that look up purchasing boxing shoes. So if you go into a Dick's or Modell's or whatever you have closest to you that's a sporting goods store, always ask for either boxing shoes or wrestling shoes. Wrestling shoes are pretty much the same. The whole point is that you want something that doesn't have a heel and has ankle support. That's the most important thing. And then in regards to gloves, you can get, for starters, Everlast, Title. Depending on how old the person is, and depending on where they're at with their upper body, I always suggest getting 16-ounce gloves, just because that's what USA Boxing requires for sparring. And what I think is good is if you get a 16-ounce pair of gloves and you also get yourself a 14-ounce glove or a 12-ounce glove, if you start training with the 16-ounce gloves, once your upper body gets used to throwing with those heavier gloves, once you put on a pair of 12, 14-ounce gloves, like, oh, this is a lot easier to hold. And it helps build that upper body that you're not realizing you're building.
Yeah, that's good information. I couldn't agree more. I have 16-ounce gloves and 12-ounce gloves. And with my clients, I typically use the 16-ounce gloves, at least to start off. Number one, helping them build those anterior delts, because I have to hold those gloves up working their shoulders. But there's also more padding on it, so they're maybe not as worried about, throwing those punches and hurting themselves.
Yes.
So,
And also I wanted to say with the wraps too, wraps are really important, especially when you're still learning how to throw the proper way. We have a tendency sometimes to not hold a steady wrist. And when we hit the bag or we hit mitts, we may roll our wrist or we may hit with our fingers, and that could really, really hurt. So wraps are really important. I always suggest 180 wraps. Again, you can get them from Title, Everlast. The longer the wraps, the better, because you can add more wrap to your wrist and knuckles for extra support.
yeah, I have basically a permanent injury from not wrapping up one day. I was late to my one-on-one like Muay Thai session, and I just threw my gloves on. And of course, we were throwing heavy hooks on a 120-pound bag that day, and I jacked my wrist up. So it's not worth it. Have good wraps and save your hands. And I think for people who don't know otherwise, they think the wraps are for their knuckles, kind of, but really that's secondary to your wrist, right? We want to keep complete wrist support because, like you said, as you punch, that hand can move there, evert and invert, and then you're going to hurt your wrist here. So continuing this conversation concerning the equipment, I think some trainers might also think, well, what can I do in boxing? Like there's only so many things you can do, right? And that is completely the opposite, right? There is a zillion things you can do. And part of that is you have to go to your first boxing training or your boxing class to see how they set things up, right? All the different drills. You can run a line, a rope across the room, right? And duck back and forth. You can do your shadow boxing. You can focus on your jab. You can stand on unstable surfaces. You see people standing on the tire back and forth to get that flow. I mean, there is endless exercises you can do if you're creative with boxing. But what I would recommend personally, and I'm going to see what you would recommend, is if you're starting out as a trainer and you're working with someone boxing, you have mitts and you have a bag. And that's really all you need right away, right? And you can get creative with the other things. You don't need a ring, right? You don't need all these other special equipment. If you were starting your own, let's say, small boxing studio and you only had a few $100s, what was the equipment that you would buy to start?
To be completely honest with you, even before getting a bag, honestly, I would start with either light dumbbells, or I like to use egg weights where you can actually put the egg weight in your hand. And shadow boxing is really the foundation of any boxer. Because when you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you're looking at your form, you're learning how to correct your form. What you do in shadow boxing, this is what I tell my clients, what you do in shadow bag is what you do on mitts. What you do on mitts is what you do in the ring. So it all really does start with working on your form in the mirror while shadow boxing. And that's something that I stress to my clients when a client only comes once a week and I give them a homework assignment of, I want you to do this at least 3 times before you come back here. And I have them work on, say, the hook, and they come back the next week and their hook is the same. And I say, did you work on this at home? No, I just, I don't have the equipment. Do you have a mirror? Yes. Do you have hands? Yes. Then you could have shadow boxed at home. There's no excuse not to be able to implement boxing into your workout, whether you're at the gym or you're at home. So I would start with just light weights just to build that upper body. And you can even get one of those ladders too, so you can work on footwork.
Yeah, the agility ladder is great. And I echo your thoughts there on shadow boxing. I think shadow boxing is difficult, but in a good way, right? It really does correct your form, because when you're actually hitting pads, you get that reverberation backwards, right? So I throw a 2 or whatever across and I make impact and I know what's going on, right? I'm like, you know what? I didn't feel power there, so I must not be driving through my hip, or I didn't, I was too close to the bag or too far from the bag, right? You learn distances and all those things. But with the shadow boxing, you don't always have that sort of secondary feedback. So you have to use your sort of visual acuity and look more like, does this look right? Right? Am I flowing properly? So although I think it's harder, I think it's almost as important, if not more important, to continue that task.
I think it's hard shadow boxing, especially for beginners. One reason why in the beginning when I started boxing, I hated shadow boxing was I didn't open myself up to creativity of being open to looking weird while shadow boxing. Just punching air just looks awkward in general. And when you're still learning your footwork, and if you are at a gym and you're doing it in front of people, you're afraid of looking stupid. But the beauty of shadow boxing is this is the time where you want to mess up, where you want to figure out what fighting style is best for you, because you can go to a trainer and they could teach the way they fight. But then you can go to another trainer and they'll teach you another way. And it's not that it's wrong, but it's their way of fighting. And you have to kind of take a hybrid of the two and figure out what works best for you. And that comes also from shadow boxing. Being creative, finding different combinations oh, I actually like that jab cross, uppercut cross, or I don't like how I throw that hook. And it's just, this is the time to experiment. That's when you're shadow boxing, you, the mirror, it's kind of like your own little laboratory. And I think that once you put that into perspective, you learn the combinations and you just learn to let go and just let it happen. I think that's when the fun begins when it comes to shadow boxing.
It's a great warm-up exercise too, because you're moving in all planes of motion, right? You have the sagittal, the frontal, you have the transverse, you're rotating when you're throwing the threes and the hooks. So I think I call it 1, 2, 3, 4 with my clients, just because it's easier than
Yes.
jab, cross, hook, uppercut. But so you're moving in all directions when you're going through this. So it's a fantastic warm-up, just to sit in front of the mirror, even if you're not doing boxing that day, right? So let's go ahead and say you're doing an upper body or a lower body workout, 8 to 10 minutes of shadow boxing to sort of correct your form and keep you up to date on your boxing skills. And then going to the workout is really great. It's much better than hopping on the elliptical for 8 minutes
Yes.
and only moving in one direction. And then not also, like you said, using your mind and having that sort of creativity impacted into your workout.
Yeah, we have a lot of professional basketball players, professional baseball players that come in and they use boxing just as a different full body conditioning workout for them on the off seasons, just to keep themselves still working out, still getting that full body exercise and working on that upper body strength in a way that isn't conventional for the usual practice of whatever sport they're in. So I think it's really cool how boxing can be implemented in any activity that you do in your everyday life.
Yeah, and not only any activity, but any demographic. So you just mentioned you work with athletes, right? Even professional athletes of different sports. I'm on the other end of the spectrum. So I work with people who are in their late 70s who have movement disorders, Parkinson's and MS and these sorts of things, right? That's who I box with, that majority of my clients. And it is fantastic for them. They've actually done a lot of studies that showed the hand-eye coordination kind of slows down some of their some of the things that they're losing cognitively, right? They're maintaining a cognitive level because of the fact that their proprioception is up, and they have to think when I tell them to throw a combo 1, 2, 3, slip 4, 3, and they have to go through that, and they're hitting the bags and they're getting the feedback back. It really helps them, and they enjoy it. Like you said, it's a way to get blow off some steam. So it doesn't matter the demographic. If you're a trainer and you're interested in boxing, whether you train 75-year-olds or professional athletes or housewives or house dads in between, it's for everybody.
Yeah, that is the beauty of boxing. It is for everyone.
So let's get into the last question concerning fitness and boxing. And then I'm going to actually ask you some boxing related questions. Okay. So fitness wise, we talked a little bit about the sort of proprioception and the ability for all demographics to use it. But I want to talk about the cardiovascular component, because boxing is tough. If you're just shadow boxing and maybe you're not doing it the right way, it doesn't look that hard. But it is quite the workout, especially because if you think about throwing a punch as hard as you can, you're essentially chest pressing every time you throw a punch, right? You're pushing forward as hard as you can. And I think people don't get that. And I have a lot of clients who are, let's say, runners or swimmers, and I need to get them to do something different because maybe they have a lower body injury and they can't run that day. And we put the gloves on and they are sweating profusely and their heart rate is pumping. So I want you to talk a little bit about maybe some drills that you run with clients and how you use that for like a cardiovascular component.
So one of the other things that I would like to tag on to what we were talking about, if I were to have like a very low budget gym, what would I add to my gym? When you said cardiovascular, I was like, jump rope. Jump rope's the first thing that comes to mind. Jump rope is so important. And when I have clients come in, I always ask them, when's the last time you jumped rope? And typically when they're in their 20s, 30s, they're like, yeah, elementary school when it was in the playground. And I was like, did you have fun doing it? And they're like, yeah, that was the best time. I'm like, well, it's not going to feel like that this time coming around. Jump rope is very intense. And people don't realize that because you're used to when you're little, you're skipping and your energy is all over the place. It doesn't feel like anything. But when you exhibit it back as an adult and you haven't done it in a while, jump rope, also including different footwork drills while you're jump roping, whether it's the crossovers, the double jumps, is very demanding on the body. And not only is it demanding on the body, but it's also on the mind too. So not only are you working your cardiovascular, but just mentally it's draining because you're focusing on your footwork, you're focusing on where your hands are moving. When you're doing a double jump, you want to make sure you pick your feet up enough so that the rope can go underneath you twice. It's it's very intense. So cardiovascular wise, I always suggest going into jump rope, especially because like I mentioned, it's very important for footwork, which again, footwork is the foundation to boxing. Also, I always suggest for people that maybe they're not the best runners, I always suggest doing bag work too, because not that you're running 100 miles per hour while you're hitting the bag, but just the adrenaline of constantly hitting a bag that's 80 to 120 pounds is very demanding on the body, and your cardiovascular definitely increases through a 3-minute round.
Yeah, and adding to what we said before about being creative with the shadow boxing, I think you could do that with the jump rope too, at least I do. So not surprising to anybody, I'm a terrible dancer. But when I'm jump roping, sometimes I feel like I'm dancing because how you switch up your feet, right? So you go sort of heel toe, and then you're both on your toes, and then you jump high, and then you jump low, and you're all around, right? You can shift your body left and right, and the music's on, right? You have some headphones on, and you can kind of get into your own little creative zone when you're doing cardio. And that's very important because cardio is boring for most people, right? They don't want to just sit on a Stairmaster or an elliptical or walk. But with the jump rope, you can start being creative, like you said, do the different footwork drills, much like you can with the shadow boxing. And creative cardio is important to keep us, from not wanting to hate cardio.
Cardio and boxing is definitely mental in the sense that you can either skip rope for 3 rounds and not be exhausted because you're just going slow, or if you break through that mental and push yourself past your limits, can be some of the toughest 3 minutes of your life. So I definitely think if you can either have the self-discipline to do it yourself, or it's really important to have a trainer push you past the limits that you may not know you have, and just take it that next level, and just continue to level up in your cardio journey.
So on top of training boxing yourself and working with clients in boxing as a trainer, we hinted at it before, you're also involved in media related boxing. You interview fighters, you have a podcast concerning interviewing fighters in the boxing world. So we're going to go into some boxing specific questions right now. And the first question I always have, I'm a big mixed martial arts guy. So that's what I follow. Boxing is sort of secondary for me, but will there ever be a unified champ, a one belt champ in boxing? Do you see that ever happening?
I really don't. And I think that you see a lot of people ask, why are there so many belts? And at the end of the day, just like any sport, it's all about the money, right?
Yeah.
It's, if it came down to it just being one belt where you maybe had 1 to 4 fights, it would be probably about 1 to 4 fights a year. That's like a championship fight. That's not really going to pay the bills, right? You'd rather probably watch a boxing fight that's for the championship of the WBO of this specific weight class, rather than it just being so-and-so versus so-and-so just to add to their record, right? So it's all about the marketing. It's all about how they can get more ticket sales or pay-per-views. So, and unfortunately, it comes down to these promotional companies having to clean their stuff up and kind of get back into what boxing was about. It's all, now we don't see some of the fighters that we want to fight each other because it's all about the mandatories, and it gets all into this technical fine print stuff that no, we want to, if the viewers want to see a fight, make that fight happen. Stop reading the fine print. That's not what boxing is all about. So will we ever get to that point? I don't know. I feel like we're kind of too far deep, but I think that it's getting acknowledged more and more. And I think more promoters that originally were fighters are starting to come out, including Floyd Mayweather talking about that issue. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it seems like you'd have to blow the whole thing up and start over. Like you said, if you're so far down this path and there's so many people who have power who don't want to give it up for these individual belts and these individual promotions, it's unlikely to change. But I do think the one thing that could help it is, at least, when I buy a UFC undercard or when I'm watching it, I know all those undercard fighters from most of them. Right now, I'm a big fan, but a lot of times I'm not even looking at the headline fight. I'm looking at the next 5 or 6 fights, and I will sit down for 4 to 6 hours and watch all these fights. Where in boxing, most people are casual fans looking for just the headline fight. They have no idea who's fighting in the fight beforehand. So I feel like promoting those undercard fights a lot more and making them really big, like you mentioned, maybe you only have 4 cards a year, but they're absolutely stacked, and people put that on at 3 p.m. and they don't turn it off till 12 at night. I think that would really help sort of boxing's issue, at least with the one belt with the multiple belt situations, having a plethora of undercards that are top notch.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, while that in a perfect world, that sounds amazing and ideal, it is just so corrupted and it's all about the money. And these agents, these promoters, they're blind to it all. They don't see what the common boxing fan wants. It's all about what are we going to get? You have to understand too, is with all these different belts and these different sanctioned fighters, when these fighters win, they have to pay a sanction fee. And so again, it comes back to the money. If it were just this one belt, we wouldn't be having all these millions of sanctions fees. All this money is going into all these different pockets. People need to get paid, and this is how they do it. So it really is. I mean, and I personally would rather, I like seeing on DAZN or on ESPN, seeing fights every single week. I don't think I would look forward to just seeing 1 to 4 big fights a year. I like kind of how the past couple months have been stacked up. And I know we have to make up for lost time from 2020, but I've been liking the lineup of what we've been seeing with fighters coming out and getting back into the swing of things.
I hope sooner rather than later, there's some sort of like contender series. There was a long time ago. I remember being a kid in New Jersey watching like an ESPN boxing contender series. I think it was somewhere in like, I don't know, maybe the 150, 55 pound range. And they had a bunch of these guys come on who were amateurs or just getting into their pro careers. And they fought in a tournament, much like the UFC has in Tough, The Ultimate Fighter, where they all lived in a house and there were 16 guys and they fought until there was one person and then they were granted whatever, $500,000. And I feel like the stories, right? That's what pushes anything. As a personal trainer, somebody who wrote a book, it's you try to build a story, craft a story about yourself. And I feel like if these boxers have better stories behind them, and they all have fantastic stories, some of the best stories ever, right? This is route to rise. These are people who came from nothing and built their way up. But to display those stories, I think is imperative.
Yeah, and like you said, it's all about representation. There are some amazing fighters out there that we will never hear of just because they don't have the right representation. So I think it comes down to, while fighting style and obviously talent is important, it's not everything. It matters about, as long as you need to have a good team too. If you don't have the right team behind you, you're not going to get anywhere in the boxing industry, and you're not going to be seen, and you're not going to get the respect that you deserve. So I think that's really important to acknowledge as well.
What are your thoughts on these exhibition fights? You have, Floyd Mayweather fighting Conor McGregor a few years back, and then you have obviously the Paul brothers, and now you have one of the Paul brothers fighting Tyron Woodley, who's one of my favorite UFC fighters of all time. Do you think this is good for the sport? Do you think it's not even boxing itself? This is just purely some sort of exhibition kind of entertainment? How do you feel about these things?
So originally, I thought it was kind of a slap in the face to boxing, and I'm not going to pay for an exhibition fight. I'll tell you that. I've never paid $1 for an exhibition fight. I'll watch the highlights after, and I make a point of that. But I've talked to other professional boxers, and they do have a good point. At the end of the day, exhibition fights are not professional fights in the sense that it doesn't go on a professional record. So I don't think that it's necessarily tainting the boxing industry. And I think especially having these TikTokers and YouTubers coming into the boxing scene, I think it is bringing a younger demographic. You saw the Paul versus Mayweather fight. If you looked in the stands, it was all 13, 16-year-old kids. And while it is a little weird because you watch certain fights and in the beginning it says encouraged for 18 and older, and now you have 13, 16-year-olds going to these fights, I think that it is important to bring that awareness of boxing, because I think for a while, boxing was kind of low key. I think that there wasn't a lot of fans going to the fights. I don't think there was a lot of good fights happening. There wasn't a lot of representation. Honestly, MMA definitely kind of took the shine from boxing. And so boxing needs to kind of do a little bit of rebranding, a little bit of cleaning up. So I think that if these exhibition fights, as long as they're exhibition fights, I don't see the harm. And I think if anything, it's just helping build the word about boxing and making more kids, more younger demographic curious about this sport.
Yeah, some people say there's no such thing as bad coverage, right? Coverage is coverage. It doesn't matter how it's coming about. And if boxing is being covered, even if it is exhibition matches and some of them are, YouTubers and TikTokers. Hopefully that'll add to people watching this fight, being interested in boxing in general, right? The young generation, which is important. And then they ask mommy and daddy to bring them to another boxing match, right? Because they're interested in it. And then the sport grows that way. So is there a fight that you're looking forward to in 2021? I'm sure a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are not big fight people. If you can tell them, hey, this is the fight you need to watch, what would it be?
Well, I'm very heartbroken that Fury Wilder 3 isn't happening on July 24th anymore, but it is getting pushed back to October. Okay. So I am looking forward to that fight. I would love to see Fury Joshua fight. But it definitely just, it's crazy how one fight like that pushes back a lot of other fights that should be happening. Just because if Fury or Wilder wins, who's going to fight Joshua? Who is Joshua going to fight in the meantime? So that definitely plays a big role in it, but I would love to see Fury Wilder 3 happen. Definitely want to see Canelo back in the ring again as well. I think that Plant's going to be the next fight, I'm pretty sure. I know that they're right now going through a contract. They're trying to guarantee like a 3-fight deal or something. So if that doesn't pull through, then Canelo has to fight somebody else. It's really hard to find a decent fight for Canelo at this point because he is right now the best pound for pound in the sport. But just Canelo is just entertaining in general. So watching anything with him would be a great fight.
And what about Pacquiao Spence? Do you have any intrigue about that?
I do. Respect for Pacquiao because he is one of the few fighters still out there that will level up and will continue to fight a good fight. He just won't pick a fighter that he knows he can beat. This is a challenge for him. I think that Spence will win. But I definitely think that it will still be a very good fight and Pacquiao will still win a couple rounds in that match.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of boxing to be watched in 2021. Like you said, there's the heavyweights are there. And, I would tell everybody also to help yourself learn boxing. It's important that you watch a little bit of boxing because you're going to pick up different things and techniques. Go to a class, get a one-on-one personal training session from someone like you who does it locally in your area, watch a little bit of it. And it's another tool to add with your clients. Right? We're always looking for tools to add to our clients as personal trainers. Things get boring. You can't always put them on machines. They don't always want to do yoga. Any little thing that we could add to it is part of our job. It's they expect us to add these things in. And there's multiple ways to use it. I want to add it's, you don't just have to use it one-on-one. I ran a class called Moms in Martial Arts, where I had 7 to 10 women. There was two people doing bag work. People were doing mitt work together. People were doing crunches on the floor, ab work. People were running through the agility ladder. And then we switched stations kind of, right, in a 40-20 format. So there's more ways to use it than just teaching perfect technique, right? You can use it in a safe way where they're learning technique little by little, but the emphasis is on exercise first. And then they eventually learn the technique. So with all that said, why don't you tell the listeners where they can learn more about boxing following you on Instagram and otherwise, and where they can maybe reach out to you personally and how they can listen to your podcast?
Awesome. So you guys can follow my podcast page on Instagram at Inside the Ring Official. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Inside the Ring Official. You can also check out my personal Instagram at Rebecca Ruber, where I post a little bit about my boxing, as well as just kind of follow along my general fitness journey. And you can follow me on Twitter at Rebecca Ruber. I typically, when big fights happen, I like to live tweet about the fights, the undercards, just so for those that aren't watching, I like to make them feel as part of the fight. And I also like to weigh in on different things going on while the fights are happening. And I like to engage with my followers. So please feel free to reach out to me. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, RebeccaRuber@gmail.com. And yeah, that's pretty much all my, and you can also listen to my podcast, Inside the Ring with Rebecca Ruber, on Apple, Google, Spotify, and iHeartRadio.
Inside the Ring, give it a listen. Follow Rebecca. Thank you so much for being with the Trulyfit Podcast, and I hope to have you on another one down the road.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me on.